Hello there! Welcome to my Uldaman Legacy of Tyr Mythic Dungeon Guide. In this video, I'll extensively cover the abilities of all enemies you will face in an Uldaman Legacy of Tyr run. Uldaman is the dungeon with the longest timer in Season 2, and in addition to being fairly long, there is a fair amount of group-wide damage that goes out, par for the course for the remaining 4 Dragonflight dungeons. I'll be making a dungeon guide on all 8 of the slated Mythic Plus dungeons for Dragonflight Season 2. I'll also be uploading a recap video every week where I discuss cool new tips and tricks I discover over the weeks. If you want to catch either of those, be sure to subscribe. Just like with my other guides, I'll be marking important or impactful mob abilities in red and less important in green. Additionally, I'll be marking out abilities with their associated counterplay, including magic effects, enrages, curses, interrupts, bleeds for Draktheirs, and poisons or diseases. Let's talk about the dungeon first. Throughout the first half of the dungeon, there will be multiple mining nodes that you can use if you have mining level 25. Mining the node will grant your entire party a 10% speed buff for the whole dungeon. There are 3 that I know of throughout the dungeon. 1 at the start, 1 behind the Dwarves, the first boss, and 1 next to the second boss. That totals up to 30% movement speed. A considerable number for the whole dungeon. It's great. That's all I've found, but if you do manage to find more, be sure to leave it in the comments. Past that, let's jump right into the mobs. The first mob you'll meet is the Scavenging Leaper. They only have one ability that you can dodge. It's called Ambush. They'll jump towards a random ranged player, and then after landing, they'll do a small swipe around their position. These mobs are fairly easy, so I imagine most groups would combine them with other mobs. The next mob you'll face is the Stone Vault Geomancer. You'll want to pay attention to these 2 mobs, as you'll see them again on a boss fight later on. The Geomancer casts 2 abilities. Stone Spike is a direct damage cast dealt to the tank. They will continuously cast this, so if you want to move them, you'll need to interrupt them. Chain Lightning, their second ability, is exactly the same, targeting the tank, but it also bounces to 2 additional players. Because of this, Chain Lightning is a bit more dangerous, so you'll probably want to kick this. The next mob you'll see will be the Hulking Berserker. The Berserker is pretty dangerous, and it casts quite a few abilities, the first of which is Brutal Slam. It's a large AoE damaging circle that you'll just need to walk out of. It will stun you and do a lot of damage, so you really want to avoid it. The Berserker also has a Tank Buster and Diseased Bite, dealing some damage and applying a 30% slow. You'll want to cleanse this. And finally, when the Berserker hits 40% health, they'll cast Reckless Rage, granting them and all nearby enemies a 20% damage done and 20% reduced damage taken in rage buff. You'll want to try to soothe as many as you can, and potentially kill it last. An interesting point about this last ability is that the Berserker will interrupt their current cast to cast this in rage. So for example, if it's casting Diseased Bite, it will cancel that Diseased Bite cast and immediately start trying to cast the Enrage. This means it will almost always successfully finish casting this Enrage. And it does stack, a fact that will be relevant later when you have a pack with 2 of these. The last unique mob you'll see before the first boss is the Vicious Basilisk. The Basilisk has a tank hit in Chomp, applying a bleed that lasts 9 seconds. This does stack when applied multiple times, so beware pulling multiple Basilisks at the same time. They also cast Spiked Carapace, dealing damage to you when you deal damage to them. You can purge it, and you probably should. It can hurt quite a bit if you pull multiple Basilisks at the same time. While you can skip the first boss for now, you will need to kill it eventually, so let's go straight to the first boss first. The first boss is a 3-unit fight, and there's a bit to cover, but it's actually fairly mechanically simple. The first dwarf is Balog. Balog has 2 abilities. The first is a tank buster called Wild Cleave. It deals a lot of damage and it is a cleave, so tanks you'll want to face it away from the party. Balog also casts Heavy Arrow, a considerable tank buster, and just like the cleave, it is a frontal, so tanks, once again, face it away from the party. The second dwarf is Eric the Swift. Eric also has 2 abilities. The first is Dagger Throw, where they throw their dagger at a random player, dealing some damage. It's just something for the healer to heal through, really. Their other ability is Skullcracker. Skullcracker is where after a short delay, you will charge into a random player. It's fairly slow, but if you are hit by it, you'll be disoriented and take a lot of damage, so dodge it. And lastly, the third dwarf is Olaf. Just like the others, Olaf has 2 abilities as well. The first is Ricocheting Shield, which is a projectile that can potentially bounce to up to 4 players within 5 yards. The person who gets it has a circle around them, so it's fairly easy to dodge. spread out to minimize damage taken. Olaf's big ability is Defensive Bulwark. It's a long duration cast, which reduces the damage taken of all dwarves in an AoE by 75% for its duration. You will want to interrupt this. And finally, all the dwarves have a shared energy bar. When they hit 100 energy, they will all summon a longboat and all jump into it. For each dwarf alive and crewing the boat will gain an increased rate of fire. The boat itself fires cannonballs all around the room. Each time a cannon fires, they'll deal some damage to the entire party through Fiery Surge. Additionally, each cannonball is a swirly. Upon landing, it spawns a large puddle of fire. Getting hit by the initial swirly will apply a burning debuff on you, so you'll really want to avoid these. You can still damage the bosses in this phase, so keep damaging the boss. Healers, you can dispel the burning dot if people are hit by the cannonballs, so keep that in mind. That's all this boss has to offer. As a side note, these Lost Vikings are a reference to Blizzard's old game, and they're even color-coded, red, green, blue. I've never played it, but if you have, it's a nice little Easter egg. The path to the second boss only actually has one new unique enemy. It's called the Burly Rock Thrower. The Rock Throwers are quite harmless, only casting Rock Throw. It does direct damage to players caught in a swirly after a travel time. You can't interrupt it and they spam cast it. This makes it quite difficult to pull them with other mobs. The tank will probably need to utilize line of sights and try to group everything up through that. These rock throwers can be fairly annoying for casters since they do spawn a lot of swirlies. Just a heads up. And with that, we're already up to the second boss. Bromach is the second boss, and like the first boss, isn't too mechanically complex. He begins the fight by casting Call of the Deep, spawning 4 trogs on 4 different locations around the room. These trogs will always spawn in a specific combination, 1 Geomancer and 3 ambushes. If you can recall from earlier, these ambushes just jump to random players through ambush, and the Geomancer casts Stone Bolt and Chain Lightning on the tank. You'll want to do your best to interrupt the Geomancer to bring it into melee range to cleave it better. The boss then may cast Thundering Slam, a large 23-yard AoE slam that will destroy you. Just run out of it as quick as you can. This next ability is important. The boss will summon a Quaking Totem that deals continuous pulsing damage to all players every 2 seconds for as long as it lives, so you'll want to destroy it as fast as you can. Additionally, upon death, it explodes in an 8-yard radius. Don't worry, this swirly can't hit players, but any trogs near the totem will be stunned for 10 seconds and take 200% increased damage. Because of this, you'll want to drag all the trogs on the totem before you destroy it. You'll also want to drag the boss over the totem. The boss does get stunned, but doesn't take 200% damage. Stunning the boss can be useful for his last ability, Bloodlust. Usually a few seconds after summoning the totem, the boss will cast Bloodlust, granting him and all living trogs 30% haste buff for 20 seconds. If you're somehow able to kill the totem before he finishes Bloodlust, you can cancel it entirely. But that's a fairly tight DPS check, so chances are, you'll just stun him after he casts Bloodlust. Stunning him for 10 seconds is 10 seconds off Bloodlust, so it's still pretty good. That's all the boss has to offer. Kill the ads, kill the totem, and that's the fight. Here on out, you meet a new set of mobs, the first of which is a Refty Custodian. They can be fairly dangerous to your tank, increasingly so the longer they live. They gain 1 stack of Ancient Power every 6 seconds, granting them a 10% damage and haste buff for each stack. You'll want to remove these stacks, but there's only one way to do it. The Custodians have a buff called Antique Constitution, which makes them vulnerable to stuns. If they were to be stunned, they would be instead affected by Systemic Vulnerability, where they are stunned for 5 seconds and take 50% more damage for that duration. When stunned, they also drop all stacks of Ancient Power. So that's the trick, you'll want to use stuns to drop stacks. They also cast Jagged Bite on their current target, the tank. This deals a fair amount of damage and is amplified by Ancient Power, so plan your stuns out for these guys carefully. The other mob is the Earthen Custodian. This Custodian has 2 abilities. Rending Slash is yet another bleed applied to the tank. They also have Cleave, which does some damage to their current target, and others in a 2-yard cone. You'll want to avoid stacking on your tank for these mobs. You will see these Earthen Custodians again later on in the dungeon. There's one more mob in this area, slightly off to the side, that you can pull if your route demands it. It's called the Earthen Weaver. They primarily cast Stone Bolt, dealing damage to their current target, the tank. You can interrupt this. Their important ability is Hail of Stone, where they continuously channel for 6 seconds, dealing damage to all players in line of sight. You cannot interrupt this, and it can be fairly dangerous in large numbers. You'll want to use stuns and stops here. These weavers show up again and in large numbers later on, so keep a mental note of their abilities. That's all the unique trash you meet before the third boss, so let's move on. The dwarves bust a hole in this tomb, and the door to the third boss opens right up. Once again, the third boss, just like the first two, is not mechanically complex. Let's talk about Sentinel Talondras' biggest ability first. Talondras starts the fight at 0 energy. She will gain energy slowly throughout the fight. At 100 energy, she will cast Titanic Empowerment, granting her immunity to crowd control abilities and increasing her damage by 50% for 40 seconds. That is absurd, you cannot let this go off, and there is only one way to stop it. Throughout the fight, she will select 3 players, not including the tank, to drop Resonating Orb on. These players will want to stack exactly on each other so that you drop all 3 orbs at the same position. After a few seconds, a swirly will spawn, and everyone should sidestep this swirly. The tank will then want to run the boss through these orbs to stun her. The boss starts the fight with 2 stacks of Inexorable. Each stack will grant the boss immunity to stuns. This means you will need to walk the boss through all 3 orbs to stun her. Stunning her will reset her energy and prevent the enrage. However, after awakening from the stun, she will recast Inexorable and you will need to begin this process again. Additionally, every time she wakes up from being stunned, or completes her enrage cast, she will gain a 5% stacking damage buff for the rest of the fight. So this fight does eventually become too much for a healer to handle. Otherwise, she has one other ability. Crushing Stomp is a wave of group-wide damage which knocks everyone back. Healers will just need to heal through this. Take care not to get knocked back into orbs, as if the boss doesn't hit all 3 orbs, she will enrage no matter what. In this clip, we only had 2 players that are not tank, so the third orb will drop at a random location around the room. Ideally, in a full party, you'll want all 3 players to stack up on the same position to drop orbs. A little side note, in the dungeon journal, an ability called Earthen Shards is mentioned. It's a bleed cast on the tank. I didn't see it at all during my PTR testing, but for reference, Earthen Shards deals damage and bleeds the tank. That's it. You now make your way to what I think is the hardest boss, Emberon. You'll meet a fair number of mobs on the way there. Quite a few of them you've seen before. The first new mob you'll face is the Earthen Warder. They have quite a few abilities, the first of which is Curse of Stone. It's an interruptible curse, which is cast on a random player. The player who's cursed will gain stacks of this curse. If not decursed, at 5 stacks, the player will turn to stone. When you turn to stone, you'll have this big swirly around you. If you are dispelled, use a human racial or timeout, you will explode, dealing a good amount of damage to players around you. You have to be careful of this, as this is probably the most dangerous mob ability in this entire dungeon. At high keys, missing a kick or a decurse is almost likely a one-shot on that player. These warders also cast Stone Bolt frequently, dealing direct damage to the tank, so your tank can line of sight them around corners. And finally, they cast Earthen Ward, granting a random targeted enemy a large absorb that can be dispelled. All of the warder's abilities can be interrupted, but there are so many, and you can't possibly hope to interrupt all of them. I recommend prioritizing the curse, using interrupt and decurses for it, and using purges for the absorbs. The next mob is the Runic Protector, a fairly dangerous elite mob. They cast 2 abilities. Fissuring Slam is a tank buster, which, when they finish the cast, deals some damage to the tank and spawns a circle around all players. It's called Difficult Terrain, and while standing in it, you will take 50% more damage and be slowed by 40%. You really don't want to be in it when they cast their big ability Earthquake. They'll pulse continuously for 6 seconds, dealing party-wide damage for that duration. That's a lot of damage. Also, with the tight corridors, you may find it difficult to maneuver around these circles, so tanks will need to be proactive with their movement. Past that, you make your way to a cavernous portion of the dungeon. In this cave are 2 new mobs, the last 2 before the next boss. The first is a spider, the Skittering Crawler. The Crawler randomly casts Pounce at a random party member, so some healing is needed here. Additionally, they also have Venomous Fangs, occasionally applying poison to your tank. You can cleanse this. The last mob in this area is the Cavern Seeker, a bat which only has one ability, Sonic Burst. I'm slightly iffy on how this works. The tooltip says it silences all players within 10 yards for 4 seconds. But from testing, it seems to interrupt all players within line of sight. Honestly, you'll probably just want to interrupt or use AoE stops on these guys. And that's it. We now arrive at the 4th boss, Emberon, and while not too complicated, there is a lot of damage going out in this fight. You start the boss fight, and you may notice several stone constructs around the room. The boss will start the fight by activating 4 of the 6 Vault Keepers around the room. These Vault Keepers will then start casting Seeking Flames periodically. These orbs are deadly, so you'll want to avoid them like the plague. He then may cast his Tank Buster, Searing Clap, a far-reaching frontal in the direction of the tank. Tanks will want to face this away. This cast applies burning heat to all players. It's a fair amount of group-wide damage over 10 seconds. Priest will want to use Mass Dispel here, and you can use Mass Dispel for every cast. He then may cast Unstable Embers, throwing a fire circle around all players which explode after a delay. Don't overlap with party members, and healers need to heal through this. That's all Emberon does for the first part of the fight. At 100 energy, Emberon books it to the middle of the room and starts casting Purging Flame. Don't be in the middle of the room, as if you are, he'll knock you back, potentially knocking you back into the Seeking Flames from earlier. The 4 Vault Keepers from earlier will then become targetable, and the boss becomes invulnerable. Then, you'll need to look out for the lasers forming around the room. You'll now need to move around the room, avoid the lasers, and destroy all the keepers to be able to damage the boss again. Throughout this part of the fight, the boss will continuously deal damage every 3 seconds to all players. You'll want to finish this as fast as you can, and it is a fairly difficult healing check. But after defeating the Vault Keepers, he will once again begin his sequence, activating 4 Vault Keepers, and the cycle just repeats. Like I said, fairly easy, but very, very intensive on your healer. And now we make our way to the last boss. The path towards the last boss is quite long, so buckle up. You re-enter the tomb portion of the dungeon and face enemies you have seen before. There are a few new mobs you will see, the first of which is the Ebonstone Golem. The Ebonstone Golem is not as dangerous as the previous Golem, only casting Thunderous Clap, dealing some damage to all players, unavoidable. You can try and line of sight it, but the cast is fairly fast, so you might not be able to do it consistently. You keep pushing forward and you keep seeing mobs you've seen before, and the next new one you'll see is the Earthen Guardian. The Guardian casts 2 abilities. In addition to hitting the tank fairly hard, they also cast Bulwark Slam, a tank buster. Their big ability is Blessing of Tyr. They'll spawn a big bubble, granting all enemies in it a 20% damage buff. Any players caught in this bubble will take continuous damage. Tanks pull mobs out of this bubble, and everyone else stay out of the bubbles yourselves. You will only ever see this mob twice in this entire part, so it shouldn't be too bad. Yes, I know, all the mobs look the same, they have similar names, so it's kinda hard to keep track of what's what. Generally, just run with the tank to line of sight casts to group up mobs, use interrupts liberally, use stops and decurses liberally. Tanks, a lot of the burden's on you to carefully consider routes and mobs when you're doing the dungeon. And now we enter the last part of the dungeon, the Infinite Dragonflight part. Mages, you're gonna love this. The first mob you engage are a couple of infinite agents. These agents primarily cast Time Blade, a significant tank buster that slows the tank by 50% for 9 seconds. They also cast Hasten, a 30% haste and movement speed buff that lasts 20 seconds. You'll want to interrupt this, or alternatively, Spell Steal or Purge it. The last mob you face in this dungeon is the Infinite Time Reaver. The Time Reaver is extra deadly. For as long as you engage them, they will drain all players of 2% of their haste every 5 seconds. This stacks, so they will quickly drain a lot of haste from the entire party. Multiple Time Reavers will drain your haste even faster. For every 2% haste they remove off players, they gain 2% themselves, so they gain stacks really quickly. And at the very end, you have to fight 2 of these at the same time, so pull these with caution. Once again, mages can steal their haste buff, so you're basically stealing your party's haste. Otherwise, you can just purge it, and priests can mass dispel, clearing all stacks of the debuff off players. Really good stuff. These Time Reavers do not have true sight, so I suspect some groups will invis-skip the last pair before the boss. Okay, I lied. There is one more mob, but they don't do very much. The Infinite Whelps appear in large numbers near the final boss room. They only serve to pad your DPS, they do nothing. With that, we are finally here on the very last boss, Chrono-Lord Deios. He is fairly mechanically simple, but just like Emberon, he is a significant heal check. His primary mechanic is Eternity's ebb and flow. Throughout the fight, he will leave behind Eternity orbs thrown around the room. When they land, they will deal fair damage and spawn in Eternity's zone. The puddle deals continuous damage to players, and reduces your haste by 30%, so avoid them at all costs. Every time the boss summons a set of Eternity orbs, he'll lose 20 energy. At 0 energy, after spawning 5 sets of orbs, he'll cast his ultimate, Rewind Time Flow. A serious amount of group-wide damage will go out. But the puddles will turn into temporal zones. Standing in these zones will grant you a 50% haste buff, and no longer damage you. Stand in these if you can. They won't last long, however. As the passage of time is reversed, they will shrink and eventually revert back to their projectile form. After Rewind Time Flow is over, the orbs will turn back into projectiles and land again, so don't be around when they land. Beside that, he has a few other less flashy abilities. Sand Breath is a tank frontal that tanks should face away. Wing Buffet is a move where he flaps his wings, dealing damage and knocking all players back. Healers, be careful. And finally, Time Sink. Time Sink is fairly dangerous. He'll apply it to 3 players, doing some damage over 9 seconds. Upon dispel or removal, they will spawn a large swirly that does a lot of damage. Sidestep these as fast as you can. Healers, it's a good idea to dispel 1 player early to reduce the damage dealt to the party. Beware of your space and positioning in this fight, and it should be fairly easy. And that's the whole dungeon. Yes, it is fairly long, there's a lot of mobs, and the tuning seems to be quite difficult. But there aren't too many unique enemies in this dungeon, and mechanically the bosses are quite simple. Despite its length, I think it might be one of the funner dungeons in Season 2. We'll see. I make these videos to give players a full overview of dungeons, as I like to be well informed of dungeon mechanics myself. If you enjoyed this, leave a like or subscribe. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next Dungeon Guide.